where did they come from? Where are they going? And why do they look so pensive? I'm not talking about Cotton Eye Joe, I'm talking about the women in period costume on the cover looking away. Hey guys, welcome back to Oz and Elsewhere. My name is Rebecca, and for this video, I first wanted to talk about this genre I don't read a lot, and then it led me onto a bit of a deep dive. I'm talking about women in period costume looking away. So for those of you that don't know, women in period costume looking away, which is a very long phrase I'm going to be saying a lot in this video, is shorthand for a certain type of popular historical fiction novel. This article that I read on Book Riot called Cover Trend Alert, World War II Era Women Looking Away, traces the origin of this trend back to 2016, and then it had a bit of an explosion around from 2018 to 2021. So it's fairly self-explanatory. It usually features a cover model or an illustration of a cover model wearing period costume facing away from the viewer. Usually this is kind of mid-20th century, so either World War II or the time right after World War II. And however, it's since expanded to some other historical periods. So besides this kind of main self-explanatory description of this, there are a few other main characters of this genre. So as you can tell, usually the novels are about women and geared towards a female audience, which will be relevant later. Usually the heroine is kind of plucky, kind of independent, but not too rebellious of gender roles at the time. And with a few notable exceptions, such as books by Sujata Massey, both the main characters and the authors tend to be white, straight women. So more interesting than the conventions of the genre itself was the response, and that's kind of what made me want to do this video. So I mean, this cover trend is so ubiquitous that if you spend any time in bookish spaces, whether online or in person, you'll see it everywhere, like from displays thought up by sassy librarians and booksellers of women on the cover walking away, to entire Goodreads shelves dedicated to this, to articles like the Book Riot article that I mentioned. People tend to make a lot of kind of tongue-in-cheek jokes about this and the way it's become so ubiquitous. However, what really made me interested in making this video is the vitriol that I've seen directed at this kind of cover trend. After spending some time on kind of book-related subreddits or Twitter or Facebook groups for trading book recommendations, in the space of a few weeks, I saw maybe 5 or 10 posts where people kept saying, I'll read anything except women on the cover looking away. And that made me really think, okay, well, why do people not only not want to read this, but want to make sure everybody else knows that they don't read this? And what is it? What is this genre exactly? Because I also don't read this very often. So that's why I decided to make this video. But, you can't really talk about a genre just based off of Facebook comments and Book Riot articles. So to start, I needed to read a few books where the women on the cover were all looking away. So the first book that I read is the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society by Marianne Shaffer and Barrows. So the methodology I used to pick these books that I read for this video was kind of diverse. So it's very unscientific. I went through my library's kind of online ebook collection and just clicked historical fiction, scrolled until I found the first few books with women on the cover looking away that were available, except for this one. So the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society was referenced by a number of articles, including the Book Riot article I mentioned earlier, as the book that kind of kick-started the women on the cover looking away trend. And it's also one of the most popular historical fiction books of the 21st century. It's inspired a Netflix movie, countless book clubs, so I figured I'd read it. If, like me, you hadn't read this, so the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society, which is not going to win any points for a title easy to say in a video, follows the story of a writer from London named Juliet and a group of residents of the island of Guernsey, which is one of the Channel Islands, who meet her after one of them, Dawsey Adams, finds her address in a used book and decides to write to her. So the book takes place in the years right after World War II, where Guernsey, which was the only part of the United Kingdom to be occupied by Germany, was finally liberated, and the residents are still desperate for kind of interaction with the outside world, which was completely cut off during the occupation. It's told entirely in epistolary form, including one very memorable journal entry, which I thought was very well done. Normally this kind of stuff doesn't work for me, but here, we still got a very good view at the characters and a very good insight to the warm way their relationship developed. And it actually added more suspense to it because, you weren't getting the actions in right away. It's kind of slightly removed because you have to wait for a character to write a letter about it. And I was interested enough in this that I read it in a day, and I finished work early just because I wanted to read it, and it was very kind of cozy and very fun to read. However, the coziness is also one of my main criticisms of it, and this is something that I encountered a lot in the genre, where it's kind of weird that a novel set right after a German Nazi occupation in World War II can be described as cozy. And I felt that it kind of sanitized the experience of people living under Nazi occupation, which, after reading some reviews, I found that some Guernsey residents, well, many of them feel, are thankful that this novel kind of brought global attention to what they went through. Some of them feel as if it really sanitized them. So, there's only 2 people in this book that get sent to concentration camps. One is someone that died off screen before the events of the book, and another is a side character whose, story is very briefly mentioned. And then there's a third character that's a concentration camp survivor, which, this is a spoiler, but it's a French woman named Elena, and her presence kind of serves mostly to complicate the love triangle between the 2 main characters, which I found kind of offensive that that's all that her character got boiled down to a bit. And this is something also, the historical accuracy, apparently Urchemi is now a gender neutral name, but after some research, I found that really only arose not very recently. A character who would be born in the 1920s probably wouldn't be named Clemmy. I hope some native French speakers can weigh in on this, but as someone who studied French and lived in France for a while, it seemed, a little bit out of place. So, it was fun, but a little bit formulaic, and this, I think, it introduced me to some of the criticisms I would have of the genre, which is this kind of sanitizing view of history, of turning often very traumatic periods into fodder for cozy novels. But I had a good time, so I guess all in all positive, and it helped me kind of hone some criticisms that I had and decide what I like and dislike about historical fiction. So the second book that I read, which I found through my random searching method in my library, was The Lost Dresses of Italy by M.A. McLaughlin. So this follows an American war widow, Marianne Baxter, who in the years right after World War II gets invited to Verona, Italy, to analyze some historical dresses that were found in a museum and help prepare them to kind of prepare for the museum's grand reopening after the war. And the parallel storyline, because this is a novel told in 2 stories, follows the romantic poet Christina Rossetti, as the dresses belong to her during her trip to Italy. So this book suffers a bit from dual timeline syndrome, where one of the timelines is a lot more interesting, the one following Christina Rossetti, and the other one I kind of just wanted to skim through to get back to the other one. And this book was probably the most kind of typical, I guess, women on the cover walking away novel that people think about when they dismiss this genre. It was fairly formulaic. It is kind of clunkily written. There's a lot of exposition. There's a lot of, historical dumping over the course of an entire page. And both storylines have some pretty, insta heterosexual love, because another characteristic of this genre is that even though they're not romances, there usually is a heterosexual romance subplot. And it just wasn't that well written. Like, there was one twist in the more modern storyline that was so unpredictable it was bad, because there was no kind of clues hinting at it, and there was no foreshadowing at all, and it kind of felt as if the author was just, oh, what would be the least expected thing? Here, I did it. I surprised all of you, when it just didn't really work for me. When saying all this, I mean, I did read it in just a few days and tore through it because I wanted to see what happens next. So if you're into plot-driven books, I wouldn't not recommend it. And it led me down a rabbit hole about Cristina Rossetti and made me want to read more of her poetry. So overall, I'd say a positive reading experience, not my least favorite of the year. So the last book that I read for this kind of video, and the book that really made me kind of willing to defend this genre, is The Alice Network by Kate Quinn. So I found this book by randomly scrolling through the library, but then after Googling, I was debating between reading this and two others that were right on the same page. But after Googling this, I found out that Kate Quinn is actually a real powerhouse in the historical fiction genre, so I decided to read it, and I am so glad that I did. So The Alice Network is another novel told in two storylines. The first storyline follows an American heiress, Charlie, in 1947, I think is the year. And Charlie gets pregnant out of wedlock and is sent by her family to Europe to get an abortion. However, she decides to kind of forego this and instead uses the trip to kind of run away and try and figure out what happened to her beloved cousin and childhood best friend, Rose, who got stuck in France during Nazi occupation and then disappeared. And on her trip to find Rose, she enlists the help of Eve, and a raging middle-aged alcoholic who worked in I forget the exact name of this office, but the Refugee Bureau in the UK, whose name had been on some paperwork related to Rose. And then the second storyline follows Eve, who was a spy in German-occupied northern France during World War I as part of the actual real-life Alice Network, which was a network of female spies set up by the English to spy on the Germans during World War I. And this book was so well written. So, first of all, as I mentioned, a lot of books with dual timelines suffer from dual timeline syndrome, where one timeline is a lot more interesting than the other one. This one, both of them were so compelling. So Eve's was so tense that I actually found it really hard to read at some points. But Charlie's was less intense, especially because it's happening after the war. But it was still really interesting and really compelling and kind of painful in other ways. So Charlie's storyline follows the way these different characters cope with the aftermath of the war. Eve is still dealing with trauma for something that happened decades ago because she never actually dealt with it. And Charlie is dealing with awful survivor's guilt, both because of her cousin and because of her brother, who was a soldier with PTSD who committed suicide. And during their journey through France, it's a very unflinching view of what France was like in the years right after the war. And what I really liked about this book is that it showed a completely unsanitized view of what the war was actually like. I mean, we talk about one of the characters liberated a concentration camp, and he talks about his experience. We get an insight into kind of civilian massacres that happen in France and PTSD, and I felt like I learned something completely new, especially through Eve's storyline, because I feel like the popular perception of World War I, especially in the United States, where we're really removed from this war, is like, it was a lot, nicer than World War II, and I mean, it kind of sucked if you were a soldier in the trenches, but other than that, it was okay. or not as bad as World War II, but Eve's storyline really showed how, German occupation of Lille and other cities was also brutal, because usually in every war, occupying armies are awful towards civilians, and that gets glossed over in the official narrative. And another thing I really liked about this book is how both female main characters were written to be extremely complex and at times unlikable, which it's surprising that this is a novelty in our reading year of 2024, but it is. And like Eve copes with her untreated PTSD through alcoholism, and it's shown, the way her alcoholism has ruined her life and has ruined the lives of other people around her that loved her and wanted to help her. And Charlie deals with her PTSD and survivor's guilt by sleeping around, and this is shown as very unflinching way. And I mean, this is something that is still socially taboo to talk about, especially would be in the 1940s. So I like the way that the author handled this topic. And in general, there was a lot of very detailed descriptions or very complex descriptions of topics that are relevant to women in kind of wartime and post-war time, such as sexual assault and abortion. So all in all, I really, really liked this book. And I'm glad that I read it, and I don't think I would have read it had I not decided to do this challenge and make myself read a genre that I don't normally like, or I don't normally seek out. It's not fair to say that I don't normally like it, because I do like it, I just don't seek it out for some reason. Before I analyze why I think people don't like this genre, I want to talk a little bit about the community around this genre. Because usually when someone says, I don't read this or I don't read that, it's not just about the actual content of the books, it's about the people that normally read those books and not kind of wanting to be seen as that kind of person. So what are the typical readers of a book with a woman on the cover looking away? So it's obvious to say that they're usually women. These books are usually classified as women's fiction and geared towards women. At this point, it's nothing really new to say that books that are typically geared towards women are often dismissed. That's kind of a trite criticism to make at this point, just because it's now people have really realized this. But what I think is interesting is especially that these books tend to be geared towards middle-aged women or slightly older women, which is a population that is particularly kind of dismissed and marginalized, not just in their reading taste, but everywhere. So then I'll see a lot of people kind of will say oh, I don't read this because it's the subculture is that's for my mom. I don't want to read this. But I'll also see a lot of women doing this, dismissing this genre. I think it's because they know how they are perceived, and I kind of want to say oh, I don't just read the popular women's fiction geared towards me. I have more complex tastes. Another thing is, people in general read this genre tend to seek out more plot-driven books, or you could say slightly more simplistic books. David Foster Wallace, it is not. And there's nothing wrong with it, but if you're someone that doesn't really like plot-driven novels or likes books that are a bit more complexly written, it's fair to say, I don't generally like this genre because in your experience it's not for you. The last thing, and one that I think is really crucial to kind of understanding the discourse around these books, is that the community tends to be associated kind of with this conservatism, because these books tend to focus on the past, and for better or worse, they are a bit sanitized in their view of their past. So then it's associated that it's, for people that want, to think about the past and are a bit more conservative and think that modern fiction is too experimental or don't want to try new things. And to some extent, this stereotype is absolutely based on truth, and what better way to check that than to look at Goodreads reviews, and I absolutely found this to be true based on the reviews for the books I read. So for example, one of the most highly rated Goodreads reviews for The Lost Dresses of Italy gave it 4 or 5 stars, and one of the big praises was, it's good, clean fiction with no diversity bingo characters. So it's clear that kind of this is the people that tend to seek out these books, this is what they want. And it sucks that they're, that characters that would be LGBT or people of color are seen as like diversity bingo when, I mean, gay people obviously existed during World War II because otherwise the Nazis wouldn't have been putting them in concentration camps and murdering them. The same thing for people of color. I mean, like, people of color in Europe, such as the Romani, obviously existed during World War II because otherwise the Nazis wouldn't have been putting them in concentration camps and murdering them. And, I mean, this is another reason I like the Alice Network. It's one of the only books that I read that actually mentioned the Romani genocide during World War II. And a lot of these books do tend to gloss over this aspect of history, intentionally or unintentionally, so it's clear why certain readers would maybe seek this out because it just confirms their worldview. And even the reviews for the Alice Network, which I praised a lot earlier in this video, shows kind of this conservative streak. So a lot of people rated this book lower and they complained about, both Eve and Charlie were annoying and unlikable, and why is Eve just such a raging alcoholic, and why didn't she get over it? And it's, it's clear that they had very certain views about what they want their female main characters to be like, and something that complicated it didn't sit well with them. And it's clear that some of the reviews also took issue with the fact that the history was unsanitized. So they complained, a lot of the reviews complained about this one side character, Lily, who's the leader of the Alice Network, about how, she's too frivolous and she just cares about fashion. But in the author's note, Kate Quinn wrote that Lily, who was based on a real person, in all her contemporaries said that, she was very lighthearted and very, into fashion and into appearance, which was how she, first of all, coped with the stress of her job, and how she was such a good spy, because the Germans also just saw her as like some frivolous lady that wanted to buy a hat. So it's clear that, the community around, a lot of people in this community around these books, they expect a certain view of history, and they expect a certain way for the female main characters to behave. And that's why I think a lot of people maybe want to distance themselves from this. They want to say, I'm not one of the people that, wants to seek out formulaic books. I am interested in books where maybe the main characters are unlikable, or we really get into the brutality of war if we're going to be historical fiction, to kind of distance themselves. And also, I'm not one of those people that's going to complain if there's a gay person in the book. So I can kind of understand why people may want to distance themselves from this kind of reader community. Of course, this isn't at all saying that all people that read this kind of historical fiction are conservative, just that there absolutely is some kind of conservative streak in at least the most popular reviewers. So now that we've kind of discussed what the genre of women in period costume looking away is, and talked about a few examples, and talked about the community, I think it's time to get into kind of the criticisms, both fair and unfair, that myself and others have of this genre. So after, doing this investigation, I can absolutely see why some people would say, this is not for me, or this genre is not for me. There are a few, paradigms of the genre that I can understand why someone wouldn't like. So like I mentioned, there is absolutely this conservative streak. And I don't want to say, authors are intentionally writing books that appeal to Republicans, even though maybe some of them are. But, this kind of view of history as one where, like, there were nice white ladies and nice white guys, and some of the Nazis were nice. It's going to appeal to a certain kind of person, and that's maybe the kind of person that's more likely to buy this stuff, so it makes sense from a commercial standpoint, and of course there are authors such as Kate Quinn that write this genre but don't fall into this paradigm, but there absolutely is this conservative streak in the genre, which annoyed me. And it is true that, a lot of these plots tend to be formulaic. After you read a few books, it's kind of easy to know what will happen next. They're not always that complexly written. There's a lot of exposition, info dumping, unrealistic dialogue. And one of my main critiques is specifically the sanitizing of history. So, which I found very strange, considering that this I mean, these are books that are mostly set during or right after World War II, which is one of the most brutal time periods on Earth in like global history. But usually they're kind of removed from the actual brutalities of what happened. And usually that's what I found interesting. Usually the main characters are women who aren't actually from a location that experienced heavy war. Like a lot of them are from the United States and then kind of go to Europe or parachute into this location or exchange letters with someone that experienced the war. And that creates a dose of remove that can work well in the sense that, you know, then the reader learns through this character what happened, but also creates a sense of removal from the action. And another really sanitizing thing that I didn't like is that, first of all, a lot of these books are set in France or Italy, which I mean, it makes sense because France and Italy tend to move paperbacks. But usually they present a really sanitized view of what World War II looked like there, where, you know, the Nazis were evil, or maybe there were some kind Nazis, which is a trope that I hate, and a trope that crops up in these books a lot. But everyone else was, you know, either actively in the resistance or sympathetic to the resistance and were really happy when the occupation ended and tried to help people, when that's actually not true, especially in Western Europe. Usually the resistance movements touted in Western Europe were fairly small, especially compared to the resistance movement in communist Yugoslavia, where there were almost 1 million active fighters, and the number of sympathizers and people that got food and all that were much, much larger. So, but of course, you know, we're not going to write historical fiction for an American audience featuring communist resistance fighters because, well, that's a view of history we don't really like to read about in America. And this kind of portrayal of Western Europe as, you know, people were all secretly resistance kind of feeds into the narratives of these governments today, which isn't true. A lot of people were collaborators, or at least quietly sympathetic, and a lot of these places had their own, had their own kind of native collaborationist or fascist governments. I mean, the fact that most historical fiction books in this genre that I've read in Italy feature like Italian resistance fighters, I mean, Italy was the birthplace of fascism, and that is very rarely addressed. And this kind of sanitizing view of history really annoys me. However, women with period costumes on the cover looking away, not the only books with sanitizing view of history. You can argue that most mainstream presidential biographies sanitize their subjects. Most popular World War II history books sold in the United States are a very one-sided view of the war where, you know, the United States are heroes, everybody else are zeros, and we ignore a lot of kind of actual brutality of what happened. And women's mass market historical fiction isn't the only genre that's, you know, not that complexly written, not that kind of literary minded. And as a former library worker, anyone who says like I don't read women on period costume looking away, but does the same about James Patterson, who was the bane of my existence, even now 10 years later, I have major side-eye for it. What's the difference? All the books I just mentioned are written for men. Well, these books are written for women. And that's why I think there's so much more scrutiny and so much more people willing to say like, no, I'm never going to touch this, because these are books written for women by women. However, there's a major complication for all those people that are like, I'm never going to look at a book with a picture of a woman on the cover looking away, and I have 2 words, Elena Ferrante. So for those of you who don't know, Elena Ferrante is a pseudonymous / anonymous Italian author that has written several books, of which the most popular is the Neapolitan Quartet, starting with My Brilliant Friend. So, I mean, these books are not just popular, they are widely critically acclaimed. My Brilliant Friend was just voted the top novel of the 21st century so far by the New York Times. And I've read them, I think they're brilliant. the amazing thing is that every single book in the quartet manages to be better than the last. They are an amazing view of what women's lives are like, and talk about feminism and class and the family relations and patriarchy. Oh yeah, and famously, the US editions have a bad cover. It's because on the cover, guess what? There are women in period costume looking away. So then all those people saying that I'm never going to read a book with a woman in period costume on the cover looking away are now put in a dilemma by the US edition of Elena Ferrante's books. Do you stick to your guns, continue to judge a book by the cover, and not read one of the most critically acclaimed novel of the past 25 years? Or do you read it, but make sure you continue to complain about the cover the entire time so that people still know that you're one of those people that's too good to read books with women in period costume on it? And a lot of people chose the latter. And that's amazing. Like, even years after the book has come out, years after it has won awards, years after everyone knows, okay, Elena Ferrante is good. Elena Ferrante is literature, TM. Like, you're not a stupid person for reading Elena Ferrante. Nobody's going to think you're the kind of person that's going to pick up Barbara Taylor Bradford or the Guernsey Literary Potato Peel Pie Society if you're reading Elena Ferrante. People still have such this aversion to this genre that even now, so often the main conversation around these books is, well, the US edition has an ugly cover. Or it's always a caveat where every time we talk about this book, there's always someone has to mention it, at least as an aside, well, I didn't like the US cover. Honestly, it's amazing. It's amazing that even a woman who is completely anonymous still has her appearance scrutinized. That's funny. And obviously there may be some criticism to be made of the US edition. So the author Sujata Masi, who I mentioned earlier as one of the exceptions to the kind of lily white historical fiction rule, she wrote in a blog post how maybe there is some debate to be had about why men get kind of more abstract images for their covers, while women get women looking away to try to kind of signalize like, oh, this is a women's author, it's for women only. But a lot of other commentators, including one of my good friends, Vesna Vojvodić, had actually positive opinions of the Elena Ferrante cover. They said that, because of this kind of more mass appealing cover, it makes the novel more accessible to readers that maybe would think like this kind of literature isn't for them, and maybe helps bring the book to a wider audience. And when I'm being so hard on people that complain about the cover, this is kind of a cell phone. Like in high school, when I was working in the library, I was one of those people that whenever I shelved Elena Ferrante, I was like, look at this cover, I'm never going to read it, because I was 16 and pretentious. And then when I finally read it, I realized how silly I was being, and that I actually love these books, and that they are never going to be overpraised. And maybe if I was too quick to dismiss them based on this cover, maybe there were other books where I'd looked at the cover, said no way, but I would have actually liked them. So in conclusion, I'm really glad I did this video because it made me examine some prejudices that I had, where I wasn't going to be one of those people that posted online about how I'm never going to read a book with like a woman in period costume on the cover, but I also kind of subconsciously dismissed them whenever I saw them and never seek them out. And doing this video helped me find a book and author that I actually really liked, and helped me remind myself that I actually do like reading historical fiction, and I don't always want to read like super challenging books, and sometimes when I'm in the mood for a faster read, a more plot-driven book, there's a genre I can turn to with reliable expectations that I'm going to be happy. Now, of course, I'm not saying like now everyone has to go read a book with a woman in World War II era costume walking away on it. There are valid reasons for not wanting to read a genre. Life is short. You're only going to get a chance to read a limited amount of books in your lifetime, and if you've had experience with a genre and know like this isn't for you, it's okay to kind of shorthand say like this is something that I know doesn't work for me, so don't recommend this. I'm not going to pick it up. However, I find it useful that it's always good to occasionally do a check-in where maybe genres that you previously didn't like, as you get older, as you have new experiences, you do like, or you find books within that genre that you like. So it's always good to, not have super rigid rules about what you don't like. Just kind of check in every so often. Like, do I still not like this? Do I really not like this? Or was that due to social prejudices? Or is there something out there for me? And who knows? Maybe there is a woman in period costume on the cover walking away from you as well.